by saying that I could have been a great trumpet player. I could have been, but I'm not. Why? Because I suffer from Atychiphobia. I first picked up the trumpet in middle school. I played with our middle school band, and I was good, but I definitely wasn't great. I could have worked harder. I could have rehearsed more. I could have done a whole lot more to be better than what I was. I knew music, I played piano, but I never really succeeded the way I could have at the trumpet. Why? Atychiphobia. Atychiphobia made me do things that purposely denied myself any chance of success at the trumpet. I sabotaged myself at every turn. If it was something that could help me succeed, I didn't do it. I didn't step out. I didn't push myself. I didn't want to take a chance. I was unwilling to try. I can say it now, but I didn't know it then. Atychiphobia. I think all of us actually suffer from atychiphobia at some time in our lives. In fact, you might be suffering from it right now without even realizing it. Let's say a person with atychiphobia decides to start a dog walking business. They are excited, and they manage to get 6 customers in the first month. Now, to most people, 6 customers in the first month in a dog walking business is a great thing. An outside observer would say, what a way to start a business. You have 6 customers just to begin. There are plenty of businesses that begin with a lot less than 6 customers. But a person with atychiphobia doesn't see it that way. They undermine their own success almost from the beginning. They forget appointments. They don't walk the dogs for as long as they should. They don't bill their services out properly. Ask them and they will tell you that they do want to succeed. Their conscious mind says success is the only goal, but subconsciously something else is happening. Atychiphobia causes them to act irrationally. They scream at one customer for giving them the wrong size leash for the dog. Another customer is berated for not paying a bill that wasn't received because it was never sent. 6 customers become 4 customers. 4 customers drop to 3, 2, and then 1. Finally, the business has failed. The cycle is complete. That is all the result of atychiphobia. And as I considered this case study, I realized it sounded a lot like my own experience with the trumpet. I didn't consciously try to fail. If you'd asked me back then, I would have told you, yes, I want to succeed at the trumpet. I want to be first chair. But subconsciously, I was so afraid of failing in a public way that I gave myself no chance to succeed. Atychiphobia is the unwarranted and persistent fear of failure. It has devastating effects on a person's willingness to attempt certain activities. I wanted first chair in our middle school band, but I knew if I succeeded, the spotlight would be on me and me alone as the first chair trumpet. Everyone would expect me to succeed, but subconsciously I didn't take that risk for the simple reason that I might fail. I didn't feel comfortable enough with the trumpet that I thought I could make it with the trumpet. The fear of failure stopped me, even though I didn't know it at the time. As I did some reading about atychiphobia, there was one sentence that really stuck out to me. The unwillingness to try holds them back from a life of meaning and the realization of potential. No one wants to fail. An atychiphobic doesn't want to fail, but we are human. Guess what? We fail. We make mistakes. There's only one who is perfect. An atychiphobic puts that idea aside and fails anyway. To put it another way, I was so scared of failing at the trumpet that I did. I was so terrified of failure that I failed. It made me wonder how often Jesus calls us to do something and we turn him down. Why? Because we are afraid to fail. Playing a trumpet is a little thing. But what about a life change? When Jesus called the disciples to join him in ministry, did all of them immediately say yes? Are we missing a couple of disciples that Jesus talked to and they never said yes to him? Did he ask only we call them the chosen? But was he asking around? Was he checking around to see who could move forward and who might have been an Atychiphobic? Did anyone suffer from Atychiphobia? There's a reason I ask myself these questions, and it comes down to this. When we deal with apologetics, whereas we're looking at the Bible and saying, is the Bible true? Is it real? Is it what we say it is? Skeptics look at the calling of the disciples and they say, there's a problem here. Because there are differing stories in the calling of the disciples. The book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first 3 books of the New Testament, have one version of the calling of the disciples, while John's account seems to contradict the others. In Matthew 4:18, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, remember that, the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. Now, notice that. At once they left their nets and followed him. It sounds like Andrew and Peter suddenly dropped everything to join Jesus. But there is more to it. The book of Luke explains this a little more as we see in this video.
Push the boat out further to the deep water. Then you and your partners let down your nets for a catch.
Oh, Master, we worked hard all night long and caught nothing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets. James! Come on! Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man.
Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching men.
I love that moment when he suddenly realized he's about to be asked something. You notice the look on his face changes, and you see, basically, in my opinion, Atychiphobia kicking in. He's like, there's no way I'm going to do this. I'm not worthy. It's not possible for me. The fear of failure takes over. But there's something interesting about what takes place here, because in the 3 accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Andrew is called to be a disciple while at the Sea of Galilee. But in the book of John, the location is different. Andrew and another disciple who is not named are with John the Baptist when Jesus arrives on the scene. Where was John the Baptist? He wasn't at the Sea of Galilee. So John 1:35-36. The next day John the Baptist was there again with 2 of his disciples, one of those being Andrew. And when he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." John the Baptist points out Jesus and calls him the Messiah. He's the one John the Baptist has been talking about, and now he is here. Who was with John the Baptist at the Jordan River? Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee. What sounds like the same story in 2 places. So are the skeptics right? Do we have a contradiction here? Is John making up the story? Obviously, I don't believe that the stories are made up, but how can they all be true? It all has to do with chronology. I think there is a general assumption that Jesus' disciples were something special when it came to spiritual matters. We think that they had it all together when Jesus chose them. We look at the disciples as great men of faith. But why? Why do we think the disciples were great men of faith? Because of the things they did at the beginning or the things that they did at the end? If we're going to gauge the disciples' level of spirituality and understanding during Jesus' ministry, I think most would say they came up short. We don't need a lot of examples to prove it. There's Peter. Peter later denied Jesus in the courtyard of the high priest. He wasn't faithful. He lacked courage. He did things without thinking. Jesus called James and John. Apparently they followed Jesus for the wrong reasons, if you remember this scene. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Think about what they're asking. They're saying, Teacher, we got a request of you, if you don't mind. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in glory. Did James and John follow Jesus for power and glory? It sure sounds like it. Then there's Andrew. In John 6:9, before the feeding of the 5,000, Andrew said to Jesus, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these with so many? Andrew didn't understand the true nature of God. He had so much to learn about Jesus. They didn't have their spiritual acts together. All of the disciples were growing and learning along the way. They were maturing, and we get to watch it as they mature as Jesus walks through his ministry. The disciples were not born spiritual adults. They had to grow in their faith, just as we all do. And here's where chronology is so important. Even though the book of John is the 4th book following Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the description of the meeting between Jesus, Andrew, and the unnamed disciple, who I think is John, by the way, at the Jordan River takes place before the other 3 accounts. If this is true, it also means something else. These men considered the kind of risk they were taking. They were giving up their livelihoods for a man who claimed to be the Messiah. If that didn't cause Atychiphobia, I don't know what would. I believe it took some time for the men to digest what was happening. According to the book of Matthew, there were a whole lot of events that took place before the disciples were called. We think that it took place right at the beginning of the ministry. It didn't. There were a whole lot of things that happened before we ever got to that point. So the disciples had to know that there was a man running around claiming to be the Messiah. They had to be aware of it. And they had to know that Jesus was asking people to lay down their lives for him. Whether they understood what that meant or not, it did mean laying down their past lives, their past occupations for Jesus. It is my opinion that these men knew who Jesus was and probably even talked with him and discussed things with him way before they ever dropped everything to follow Jesus. We may think it was a rash decision, and I've often heard it described that way, but I think there's a little more to it. This wasn't a hypnotic trance. They had a choice in the matter. Jesus was preaching and teaching in the area. They knew about him. They spent time with him. Depending on how you interpret John's account, it sounds like many of the disciples actually hung out with Jesus. The risk was great. The chance of failure was great. And later on, when Jesus predicted his own death, he made it clear what it meant to follow him. And I suspect he said this many times, even before the disciples appeared on the scene. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And remember, they all knew what that meant. Take up your cross. They saw crosses on the hillside. They knew what it meant to die on a cross. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? Most people aren't going to follow someone they don't know. We all investigate in our own way. Some can make the decision instantly. And I believe that some of the disciples did make an instant decision. They saw proof when the nets were filled with fish, and they knew instantly there's something about this guy. I'll give you an example. A decision to get married is a major life change. As I say when I officiate at weddings, it isn't something to be entered into lightly. And before I got married, I dated for 5 years before I got engaged. And guess what? I didn't marry the person I was engaged to for 5 years. I didn't date Karen for 5 years before I married her, if that's what you're thinking. After the first failed relationship, Atychiphobia should have stepped in. I dated for 5 years and it didn't work out. Fear of failure would have been understandable. And yet I met Karen and we dated for a weekend. And we both knew that this was it. Why? What was the difference? Faith. Faith in God. I prayed. I asked God to lead me to the right person. I asked God to show me. And what appeared to be a sudden decision was actually constructed on a foundation established over years. Some of the disciples were prepared. They were ready before Jesus ever appeared on the scene. They were searching for something. And when Jesus appeared on the scene, they knew instantly. But others, it took time. They spent time with him. They investigated. They looked around. They talked to people. So how can we stop Atychiphobia? How do we conquer fear? I think the answer comes down to faith. Jesus demonstrated who he is by his actions. And to those who weren't sure or needed time, listen to how he called the disciples. I think this is really interesting. Come, he replied, and you will see. So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent the day with him. Notice that Jesus didn't say, come and listen. He said, come and see. I will demonstrate who I am to you. They had no idea that their lives would be turned upside down. They spent the day with Jesus. They spent time learning about him, talking to him. They watched, they saw for themselves. And as they did, their faith in him grew before they even decided to become disciples. Whatever fear they felt was washed away in the light of Christ. Guess what? We all come to God in different ways. Some of us instantly recognize Jesus for who he is. Others need time. Others have to get over the fear that comes with a life change. Maybe our fear is who we are. We think we aren't good enough for God. We think we have to have things together. Maybe our fear is all controlling in our lives. When Jesus chose disciples, he wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for real people. He chose people who could be changed by his love. And then he sent them out to tell the world, even to those whose lives were already marked by failure. Fear can be conquered with faith. And most of the time our fear is not as big as we think it is. The great author Sam Forman said in his book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. He quotes Brendan Francis, who says, many of our fears are tissue paper thin, and a single courageous step would carry us clear through them. We may wonder what Jesus sees in us when he calls us to be his disciples. I think, what kind of vessel am I to be carrying God's plan out in any way, shape, or form? We all have those fears. We all have those fears, the fear of failure. We all have that little bit of Atychiphobia in our own lives that we have to get over before we can move forward and cross that line and do it anyway. In spite of our humanity, in spite of our failures, God uses ordinary people, just as he did when Jesus walked on the earth. They weren't special. They weren't spiritual giants in any way, shape, or form. They had a long way to go, but they did it with Jesus. When we commit ourselves to God, we find abundant life. And when we put our faith in God, we can overcome anything, including Atychiphobia.